As you may have noticed, there was no Shark Tank episode last week. That's because my dear brother-in-law, Eli Moshe Zimbalist, was killed last Shabbat while protecting the Jewish people in Gaza. Eli Moshe was the best brother-in-law you could ask for. This is not the place to start eulogizing, but I will include a few links in the show notes for those who want to learn more about him. I will just say two things before we get to this week's episode, which is a very special one. Number one, I want to thank all of the Shark Tank community members who came to the Levaya, visited the Shiv House, or reached out online. It meant a lot to me. Number two, many people have reached out to me asking what they can do to honor Eli Moshe's legacy. Eli Moshe was a builder, and we are building a Beit Midrash in his honor. There are many reasons why this is a meaningful project, and I will include more details in the show notes. But anyone who wants to salute Sergeant Eli Moshe Zimbalist, Zichrono Livracha, this is a great way to do it, so go to the show notes and check that out. And now to this week's episode. This is actually our 30th episode, and I wanted to do something new. Instead of just talking with a Ben Torah in the workforce, I sat down with the husband and wife to hear both of their perspectives on work, family, and Jewish values. I spoke with the Mermelsteins, Aliza and Chaim Meir. Both are senior-level executives, both are committed from Jews, and both have a very down-to-earth, practical approach to life. My name is Yaakov Wolf, and this is Shark Tank.
Maybe I want to start with a professional introduction. What positions do you guys hold in your professional lives? And if you explain what exactly those positions entail.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Aliza Mermelstein. Professionally, I'm Aliza Wien. I'm a tax lawyer, and I spent a few years at the beginning of my career working at a big law firm in New York. And I've spent the last 24 years working in the tax department at JP Morgan. I'm currently the head of international tax at JP Morgan, which means I'm responsible for all tax things that happen outside of the United States, and that includes tax compliance and tax planning and tax audit and working with tax authorities across the world.
And I'm Chaim Meir, professionally Michael Mermelstein, and I currently work at a parking garage operator in New York City called City Parking. I've been in the parking industry for 10 plus years. In various accounting and finance functions. I'm the CFO. By trade, I'm a CPA and have spent my career in different industries, all in accounting and finance, but from telecom to high tech in the old .com days, if people remember that, and now in the low tech parking industry for the last 10 plus years.
Okay, and Chazal tell us that kol hatchalot kashot, all beginnings are difficult. So can you tell us a little bit about your early days in your career, especially when in America you're competing, so to speak, or you're sitting next to people who have much fewer limitations and constraints, Shabbos, Yantif, kids, family, religious obligations. So maybe tell us a little bit about those early experiences and how they're able to set you up for success later on.
So if it's okay with you, I'm going to actually start earlier than that. I'm going to start back in high school because I think a lot of what we've been able to do as a family and I've been able to do as a professional woman dates back to my high school years, where I went to Shalom High School for girls in Brooklyn, New York. And we didn't think that we weren't allowed to do whatever we wanted to do professionally. It just didn't, it never was presented to us as a choice between you can grow a healthy, happy Jewish home or be a professional. It was just understood that, people went on to have careers outside the home. Some people didn't, but many did. And that you didn't have to choose between the two. And it wasn't really until much later in my life that I realized that people thought that that was a very difficult choice. And so I'm very grateful for the fact that that was never presented as a choice. It was just presented as that's what you do. So I actually, when we got married, I was still in college. We had our first child. I was still in college. I went to law school. We had our second child when I was in law school. And that wasn't necessarily easy in terms of balancing our schedules, but it wasn't challenging in terms of making choices about raising a happy Jewish family and being a professional.
So you're saying that you started out with the mindset of this is doable, and then you had the optimism and the confidence to go for it, and you didn't think of it as a mountain or a hurdle. You just thought this thing to do, and you just used that mindset to.
Yeah, and I think that's super important. I think that when people are faced with choices or people are faced with questions about what they want to do, how to do it, where to do it, they assume that that means that you have to choose one or the other, or you have to struggle to mix and blend the two properly. And that just never was part of our thinking. And that's a huge bracha, honestly.
Okay, anything else from your early days of your career?
And just to add to that, I mean, I think thinking back on it, right? So because of what you called sort of limitations or competing, let's even call it priorities, which we're not really competing. Like Aliza said, we understood what was supposed to happen, but in some way that sort of frames the life that you have, and gives it much more structure than, let's say, some of the other people who we were working with or even competing against, who did not have those boundaries, that structure. And I remember, early on in my career, I think Aliza probably was still in school at the time. We just knew that we were both going to work hard. We were going to work long hours. We were talking a little bit earlier, pre-pod, I guess you'd call it, about, having less time to learn, obviously, and not just because you have less time to learn, but because of everything that's in your head and on your mind, about that, about what's going on when you really are working. But that structure sort of set the tone, and enabled us to carry out sort of the way we were. And I never thought of it as a plan. Okay, this is how we're doing things. It just was. There weren't really options or choices. You knew that you had to focus on your career, focus on your family, focus on your building a Jewish home and your religious life and educating your kids. None of that is optional at that time, certainly. So when there are no choices, it's sort of easy just to follow the script.
Amazing. And one of the big decisions that every couple has to make is when they think about the community that they raise their kids in, where they live in during those formative years. And you guys decided to settle down on the Lower East Side, which is not a classic move for a lot of your compatriots and family members. And you didn't have a house, you didn't have a garden, you lived in an apartment in the Lower East Side. So maybe tell us a little bit about that decision.
So it's wonderful that God runs the world, right? Because that wasn't a decision made based on where we necessarily wanted to raise a family. That was a decision made based on, I was starting school in the city. I was starting law school in the city. We had been living in Brooklyn near my parents, which was great because we had support. As I said, we already had one child, so it was helpful to have the extra hands around. But commuting into the city every day, we thought was going to be a challenge, and we were looking for some place affordable, and the Lower East Side was affordable. And Chaim Meir had family there. He had an aunt and uncle there, and a grandmother and cousins. And that's really how we ended up there. Now, we stayed because it worked, but how we ended up there in the first place was, God put us there.
Yeah, and not leaving is equal parts, I would say, not thinking about leaving, but also being comfortable. And like Aliza said, it worked, right? Especially for Aliza, who, always thought it was important to be able to get home quickly, or, while at work, during a lunch break, go up to the school and catch a Chumash play or a sitter party or something. So it was easier to not have to sacrifice either the work side of things or the life side of things. And it was at the time a community that was welcoming to us. It was good for our kids to grow up in, even though they may not have always thought that at the time. Had a lot of the characteristics that we liked, and that we wanted to have our children exposed to, whether the diversity of the community or it was a smaller community, so our kids participated much more in communal life and shul activities, right? Everyone laned, everyone davened, everyone learned how to get along with other people. Even the communal learning programs were kids from all different backgrounds, all different groups. I think one time we counted, we had, some kids around our table, and there were like 12 kids from 9 different schools. So that was something that, in thinking back on it, probably never would have happened had we moved to one of the places where we were supposed to move to, so to speak. So it really just worked. And to this day, we certainly don't have any regrets about that.
But oftentimes we can end up with a decision which seems to be way more practical than the other options, but it's still not necessarily as popular or in or mekubal, and it takes a certain amount of internal fortitude to take that path, which on paper looks right, but maybe it's not just like the thing to do. Was that something that you ever struggled with?
No, not really.
Honestly, not. Like Chaim Meir said, right? It's a community in the city, and it's a community, and that's pretty rare, right? And being in the city was important. For example, events like 9/11 was really nice that I was on the island of Manhattan with our children at the same time, and we could figure out how to get them. But even as he said, just the little things, the more normal, happy things throughout the day, if you could take, an hour or two and run up to school, that's different than having to take a half a day off to do that. And the I think it's really healthy to grow up in a community where not everyone is the same. And you see socioeconomic differences, and you see hashkafic differences, and you see just, plain level of observance differences, and you figure out how to make that work with your life.
Right. But again, sometimes it's a challenge to think clearly and to take all of the objective and clear advantages of a place and to stick with that despite the fact that it might not be so popular. So do you have any advice for people who sometimes end up at these crossroads where a decision which might look right and be right on paper and really is right according to all their values is just not so popular, not such a popular thing to do? You guys seem to have a very clear view of things, and that's something which I look up to you guys about a lot. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice on that point.
It's going to sound a little bit obnoxious, honestly, right? But so don't care, right? If you truly believe you're doing the right thing and you've thought it through and it's working for you, then you do what you think is right. This idea of external pressure, because it's not what, most people do, it's not the popular thing. Honestly, I think that's just silly, right? There are legitimate pressures that come from people close to you that you obviously need to weigh more heavily. And then you need to, not have ego if it's not working, if it ends up being the wrong decision. So you admit that and you move on.
I agree. That did sound obnoxious, but I think the point to be made for anyone that's thinking about it is to try to take those external things out of the equation, right? Whether it's the emotion, whether it's the, what are people going to think, or are we going to be able to be comfortable? And the more rational the thought process is and the more logical the thought process is, the easier it is to sort of not listen to the noise around it. It helps to have supportive families, which we did have. We were lucky enough to have that. Our parents, siblings, and family never sort of questioned us or put pressure on us. In fact, I would say the opposite. They were happy with us. They were happy to try to help us.
We each actually had a sibling that moved to the Lower East Side
after we were there.
They didn't. Neither of them stayed.
But they stayed for a few years, and it worked for them. And they moved on when it was time that they felt they should move on, and we never got that time, so we stayed.
Amazing. And you mentioned your supportive families, and I was okay to know both of your fathers who are no longer with us. Was this something that you guys grew up with, having that determination to stick with what's right? Is that something that you got from them? Do you have any examples from their life, and maybe any other enduring memories, specifically with regards to raising children, that you guys take from them?
I think, Chaim Meir will tell you, my father was famous for never really second-guessing things. He was very, very clear on what his priorities were and moving forward on that basis. And he's probably a really clear example of not really caring at all what other people outside of the people close to him and the people he looked up to thought about things. And I think that clearly must have had an influence. He wasn't loud about that. He just went ahead and did what he did always. And it's funny. I remember, and this is such a small thing and no one will think that it's unusual, but it actually was unusual growing up in Borough Park. wasn't necessarily the friendliest place to live. And I went into the dry cleaners one day to pick something up. And the guy behind the counter said, "You're my Shween's daughter?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said to me, "You should know he's the only person who comes in here and every time he walks in says, 'Hi, how are you? How's your day going?'" Right? And I was just like, because that's the thing that you do, even though that wasn't culturally the thing that you do there.
Yeah, I had a sort of different experience growing up. I would say certainly my parents and my father had very strong convictions about doing what was right, and often felt that doing what was right maybe was at odds with what everyone else was doing. And as opposed to quote unquote not caring, I think the feeling was, well, why doesn't everyone else feel this way? And maybe we can try to convince them why the way we think is right is the right way to do it. So it's a little bit of the opposite effect, or application, but it comes out the same, right? It comes out in that in both of our parents and both of our families, the strong emphasis was on more about doing the right thing and less about doing what everyone else is doing.
Do you have an example of that from
Yeah,
your childhood?
sure. I mean, so my parents moved from the Lower East Side when I was 6 years old to Teaneck. And Teaneck was not in the mid 70s what you can imagine Teaneck is today. There were, I think, 2.5 shuls. The shul that I grew up in, that my parents lived across the street from, did not have a daily minyan. And for my father, it was really important to have minyan. So for a long time, he commuted across town. He drove 2 miles or whatever to the other shul to go to minyan, and then was one of the people who started the daily minyan. And like you said before about kalas kashos, it was very kasha to start a minyan. Teaneck in the late 70s in a shul that never had one, and a 15-minute Meir may have taken an hour because it was 45 minutes to try to call people on the phone.
Before WhatsApp groups.
Before WhatsApp groups, exactly. And I would say it was also before people could sort of record whatever TV show they were watching. And if they came to Meir, they actually were going to miss it. So they asked him, "Can I just wait till halftime of the basketball game or till the TV show's over?" But he stuck to it because he thought it was the right thing. And today that shul has countless minyanim throughout the day. In Teaneck in those days, growing up, was a very sort of, I would say, split between YU and Bali Tshuva community. And my father was from a more yeshivish background, and he certainly never gave in to that. That was, even though he sort of stood out a little bit. And was unique in that sense. That for him, it was just the right thing to do. It was what he was supposed to do. And it didn't matter that everyone else in the room was, maybe looked or thought differently than he did. That was the way he was going to look, and that was the way he was going to think.
What show is that?
Beth Aaron in Teaneck. The rabbi there is Rabbi Rothwachs now.
Okay. So I think raising children can be divided into two main areas where challenges come up. One is the daily grind, and other are specific, more pointed challenges that come up. So looking back at your time, raising kids from preschool, elementary school, high school, what sticks out to you more? The day-to-day grind of keeping up with everything, or the specific challenges?
I would say for me, the specific challenges are the ones I remember more. And each child is different, as you know, I'm sure. And in our case, our children, and that they're all different. And so the daily grind for each of them meant something different. But the specific challenges really meant something different, right? I would say each one had their own sort of specific challenges. For some, it was easier. For some, it was harder. But everyone has challenges. One child in particular, I think there were a lot of more sort of big event challenges, maybe one-time things, mostly around schooling. And so that's what sort of sticks with me. But looking back, or certainly at the time, that's what the focus was. But looking back, the daily grind, I think, is important to focus on because, like Aliza said before, the little things matter and they count and have an impact. And sometimes you don't realize it. But getting through that daily grind is really important. It's really important not to take your eye off the ball. And even though it's a daily grind, and even though things seem significant, making sure that you keep keep them on that path on a day-to-day basis is really important.
Yeah, I think for me it was definitely the daily grind, although I don't think I thought about it as a grind. I mean, it was obviously it's a lot of work. It didn't feel wearying to me. I think it's just what you do. And I think knowing, like fundamentally knowing to your core what your priorities are and what things are important to you to instill in your children is the key. And I think that's not easy to do necessarily. I tell this story all the time, but I think it really exemplifies what I'm talking about. I read an article once in the New York Times about a woman, written by a woman who was an American woman who was living in Paris and raising a small child there, she and her husband. And she talked about the fact that she would go out to dinner late at night, as was the custom in Paris, and families would be sitting in nice restaurants with their children, including their toddlers, and their toddlers would be sitting at the table, and they would be sitting and behaving and eating, and if they weren't eating, they were sitting quietly. And she just didn't understand how they raised children to do that, because she, her own toddler, she thought would never be capable of doing that. And what she attributed it to was that it was just the expectation. It wasn't a big deal. You weren't asking a child to do something unusual or beyond their capability. It was just, this is how we behave when we go to a restaurant. And it was just so culturally embedded that people didn't think that they were asking a child to do something unusual. And I think having that mindset, which is you're not obsessing about it, you're not fixating on it. It is just so fundamental to everything that you do. So it kind of permeates the air, is so important, because then it's not a chore. Then it's just, this is how things are.
It goes back to your first point about shalom, is that when you come in with the expectation of this is how it is, so this is how it is. You mentioned some serious challenges with regards to some of your children and schooling, and I'm wondering if you could reflect back on that, specifically about the relationship between parents and a school and the child. We have this interesting dynamic, not a new dynamic, where the raising of a child is really a joint project between the parents and the children. So I wonder if you could reflect back on some of those challenges and how you navigated, maybe setting boundaries or trying to define the roles of the school, the administration, the teachers, and yourselves.
Sure. So we sort of had two opposite experiences. The way I would think about it is opposite experiences. With one of our children in elementary school, the schooling was not working out for our son. I'm going to talk only about our boys, and there the challenge was that we were not on the same page clearly with the school with respect to how to handle our child and how to help him through whatever challenges he was having. And so we thought at the time we were working with the school, and this was over a summer, we thought we were working with the school on a plan for the coming school year to work it out, not realizing that the school never really intended to stick to the plan that we were discussing. Maybe they were just humoring us. And so that sort of led to a big sort of blow up, and us having to take the child out of school and make a switch literally on the morning of the first day of school. So the way you described the sort of partnership between the school and the parent and the child, that was, in my mind, a really unfortunate situation. Ironically, we had the opposite experience with another high school that two of our other sons were in, and our boys were unhappy more socially. They were thriving, scholastically, their learning was good, but socially it wasn't the right fit. And there the school and the Rebbeim in particular worked with us and actually supported our decision to make a switch to high school, in both cases after 11th grade. And what I would say is in both of those cases, maybe our hashkafa wasn't exactly the same as the schools, and we knew that going in. And there's a challenge always there of, how do you instill your hashkafa in your child without sort of contradicting the school or confusing the child because he's hearing one thing in school and maybe seeing another thing at home. And so that's a challenge that many parents have unless you find the right school that's exactly like you. We've never in any of our elementary school, high school, colleges, yeshivas, seminaries. I don't think ever hit it exactly on the mark. Probably doesn't exist, but the challenge is to make it work for you once you make that decision, and not sort of confuse the child, because really that's, at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to avoid.
I agree with all of that. And I know that there are some schools of thought that, my job is just to protect my child, and that, so that means the school must always be wrong. And I know there are some schools of thought that, you never contradict the Rebbe and the school must be right. And when your child comes home and says something about what happened in school, then you explain that, that must be right. Never really bought into either of those. I think it's really important that children know that you're being honest with them, right? Like the thing that they can sniff out the fastest of everything is if you're a hypocrite. And so you need to be honest. That doesn't mean you're disrespectful, but that means it's okay to say, we do this, they do that, or they have a different understanding than we do, or this is the way it works in school and you need to follow the school rules, even though at home we think slightly differently. And obviously that's different for a 4-year-old than it is for a 14-year-old, but I think that's really important to do.
And you made a comment almost offhand, but I want to say it back to you and dive a little bit deeper, that you said that they might hear things in school and see things at home, which implies that the education in school is more about the information and the knowledge, and at home it's much more about the personal example. I'm wondering if you could reflect back on that, and maybe decisions that you might have made consciously or subconsciously that are driven by that fact, that maybe more important than anything you tell your children is what you show your children.
Yeah, I think that is a good point, and I'm not sure that I was being as careful in my language, but it is true, right? The school learning environment, a limitation, in my opinion, of it is when, let's say, you're sitting in a classroom with a Rebbe, he's just teaching you, right? You don't often have a chance to watch him, how he acts, right? That's why a lot of the yeshivas like to have, I know our yeshiva in the Lower East Side, MTJ, has a branch in Staten Island. They have a summer camp yeshiva, right? And one of the things that they always talk about is there you get to see the Rebbeim living their life, interacting with their family, interacting with their children. And it's not just him sitting in front of the classroom and giving over information. So that's a very different educational experience. Obviously, at home, I think it's more of that, right? We don't generally sit down our children and say, okay, take out a notebook because I'm going to tell you things now, and I want you to take notes so that you know what to do, right? That's more showing them what's important and what's important to you, right? So and you don't even have to say it, right? They'll know it, because if they see that it's important to you, they'll realize that it must be important.
And I'm wondering on that point, if I know that you guys are involved in a lot of different tzarchei tzibor, and sometimes people are very, very humble and quiet about what they do, and they can come to a point where they actually have to decide or think about how much to share with their children. Like I know my parents don't always share a lot of the wonderful things they do. Sometimes I find out in roundabout ways, and I'm wondering if that's something you ever think about, or it's very clear about how much you do or don't share with your kids about these projects that you're doing.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are things that you'll never find out about your wonderful parents that they do. Many of them. That is a challenge, but I don't think you ever. I'm sort of more in your parents' camp with that. They don't have to know the specifics, right? They don't have to. They don't have to know any of the details. I think as long as they know that you're doing things. An example that happened last week. We needed to exchange something with one of the local rabbis in our community. And so I asked our daughter, Rebecca, can you please bring this envelope to Rabbi so-and-so, and he's going to give you back something. And sure enough, she goes to the rabbi. The Rebbitzin opens the door, hands her something back, and says, be careful, this is cash, right? Don't lose it. So, of course, she has a million questions. What do you mean? Why are they giving you cash? Why are you giving them? And the answer to her is, you don't have to worry about the details. I mean, I think the more on point answer is none of your business. But the real answer is, you should just realize and understand that something is going on here that's related to the community, let's say, and that your parents are involved in that, and that's important. And beyond that, the details don't really matter. And I think kids will understand that. Just they'll pick up, they'll understand if you're not at home one night because you're at a meeting, or if you're involved in something, they'll get a sense from it. In other cases, it might be important to bring your children to certain, let's say, chesed type of activities. And you have to really find the right ones that are, to be done together as a family and to teach your children. And other ones are better left to be kept private. Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about balance in a specific sense when it comes to Talmud Torah and raising your children with values of Torah and mitzvot. So then there's oftentimes a tension between rigidity and flexibility. So maybe one example that I remember from your kids growing up is that there was a rule that they could daven wherever they wanted on Shabbos or during the week. On Shabbos, the rule was that they could daven wherever they wanted on Shabbos, but you, the Abba, had to be with them. It had to be a minyan that you were at as well. So I'm wondering if that creative sense of finding the balance of flexibility and rigidity is something that you worked on, had any role models in that regard, or any other good examples of that?
I don't know that we worked on it or thought about it, and I mean, maybe it's a question more for our kids. You should ask them. And that is, I think, a real challenge that I'm not so sure, looking back, that we really got it exactly right. I don't know if anyone can get it exactly right, but there definitely needs to be a push and pull there. I remember our kid's second grade Rebbe told me once, when you learn with your son, he had a Kabbalah from his Rebbeim, when you learn with your son, you should stop 5 minutes before he's going to want to stop. So so it's never a burden to him. And I remember thinking, yeah, but I got 5 minutes, and the answer is, yeah, but you might miss it by a minute, and then he's going to resent it, or it's not going to be good, and next time it's going to be harder. So you have to find you have to know your kids, obviously, and know what makes them tick, and know when to be rigid with them and know when to be flexible with them. I'm not sure I'm the best role model for that.
I guess your teacher's Rebbe's Rebbe already knew about the psychological principle of the peak end rule, where the end of an experience carries greater weight.
For sure. And he was this Rebbe was a chassid who barely spoke English. So
who, by the way, then went on to stop being a Rebbe and got a degree and opened a counseling practice
later on in life. Okay.
Some people just have the intuition. And what about with regards to Talmud Torah in your own personal sense? Without, it's obviously a challenge. You mentioned that's now a new challenge of having a little more time and how you make that transition. But back in the busier years, how did you balance flexibility and rigidity in those times?
I'm not sure I remember. I mean, things were busy. When the kids were younger, things were very busy. There was not a lot of time to learn. And like we said before, even when there was time to learn, your head was maybe not in it. And then there's priorities of learning, and then or also learning with your children, right? So obviously when you're learning with your children when they're small and young, you're not going to learn the type of things or the level that you want to and should be learning. So there's that balance. How much time to take away from communal matters is maybe a consideration. I don't really remember, to be honest with you. There was a big period of time, I'm sure, where just basic learning was what was done, and probably not much more. But what was important, I think, maybe looking back on it, is that at least for our children to know that learning is important and that there are times for it, and that you have to make times for it. To mention my father before, I talk about that a lot. He also, when he was working, did not have time to learn often, and often didn't have time to learn at all. And he retired pretty young, and then pretty much was making up for lost time. He had Sdarim all throughout the day, in all different subjects, and a lot of people commented after he passed away that was sort of, that in-between period was not even a Hesach Hadas, right? He just he was waiting to be able to find time to get back to it. So that showed us at least that it was really important. And reflecting on it, it was really important even when he wasn't doing it, because the proof is that when he did have time, he did do it. So I think that's also a lesson that maybe children can learn from their parents, and without even necessarily it being communicated, right? If they see that later on, that when there is time, there is more learning, they'll understand that when there was less time and less learning, it wasn't because the learning wasn't important. It was just because there was less time.
And you mentioned this, like, basic learning was what you're able to keep up while the years were very, very busy. Can you just give a little more can you explain a little more detail what that looked like?
I think a lot of it looked like me falling asleep at a table on Friday night, trying to, get through the parasha, or that's what I remember the most. Trying to get to a share once a week or twice a week or something like that. It was really, it was a busy time.
And you mentioned before, when you're talking about the Tzarchei Tzibur, you mentioned that if Abba's out at a meeting or Ima's out doing something to do a chesed, so that communicates something. There's also a level of communication involved in how the other spouse, which is home, communicates, Abba's at another meeting, or with a level of pride and confidence. So is that something that either of you guys ever had to work through together as to finding that balance? And obviously, if you're doing something for the tzibur, then you're doing less at home. Is that something you ever had to try to figure out the right way to balance?
You didn't have to.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah, no, I'm not so good at hiding my emotions. And so definitely there are things that you think are more worthwhile and less worthwhile. I think we were lucky in that we were pretty much aligned on, well, lucky, or hopefully maybe a little bit more than luck, pretty much aligned on those things. And so there weren't so many instances where I thought like time was wasting and could have better been spent at home. But I don't know that, well, thankfully it didn't happen all that often, but it certainly does happen. I think it's okay for kids to know that parents aren't always 100% aligned on where they're spending their time or what they think the importance of a particular issue is and how much time it deserves, but that it's still something that gets talked about and hashed through.
Mm-hmm. And then even when it could be that the specific cause is less important, but if the person who's involved in that cause and that person's judgment and values is important to you, so then you can sort of fall back on that.
Absolutely.
Okay, I wanted to transition and talk a little bit about Eretz Yisrael. It's something that you guys have always, as long as I've known you, had a very deep love for Eretz Yisrael. And I'm wondering what the roots of that are. And if you talk a little bit about the trials and tribulations of your considerations as far as spending more and more time here as much as possible, but also it's not always easy. You have a lot of family and obligations. And as we mentioned before, people who count on you and need you back home, back in your other home in America. We're recording this in your home here in Yerushalayim. So I'm wondering if you get a little history of that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's just something that I grew up with, and that this is one of these things where I think school was perhaps more of an influence than home, because it wasn't something that we necessarily talked about a lot at home. But I went to a school, from when I was 3 till I was 17 with your Ima, where that was just part of the everyday, right? I mean, we learned more in grade school about Medinat Yisrael than I think many people who live here do, right? Just because of the teachers that we had and the love that they had for Eretz Yisrael and their actual life experiences. And that definitely had an influence. And so for me, it was just something that was like, yeah, no, of course, that's just part of the path.
Yeah, I would say similar experience. It's not something that we ever really talked about at home. But it's clearly my siblings feel the same way, picked up the same thing. As you know, my sister made Aliyah once. Hopefully we'll make Aliyah again sometime soon. I think it's definitely the plan. So I can't say specifically what, someone told me or a specific point in time where I realized it. Certainly my days, as a teenager in yeshiva helped a lot. And having friends move here and make Aliyah helped a lot. As you know, we don't have too many close relatives here. But yeah, I think it was just sort of understood that this is a place that's important for us.
And you guys were here on October 7th. How has your thoughts and feelings about living in Israel changed since then?
Well, first was the reflection of like how completely clueless we were, right? Because we honestly had no idea what was going on October 7th. So that's like,
Well, you heard sirens.
no, we didn't know we were hearing sirens. We heard some sounds. It was really hard to identify them as sirens. They were not urgent
I heard
sounds.
sirens. I was in the street actually on my way to shul, and I heard sirens, and I saw three different groups of people react in completely different ways, right? So I saw, at first I didn't realize what it was. I just heard a noise, like Aliza said. And I saw one like family, like a mom and two kids who were clearly sleeping, run out and run across the little street to another place, clearly to find some shelter. And then I saw a guy jogging down the Mesilah with earbuds, and either he didn't hear it or he didn't care or was oblivious, and he just kept jogging. And then I saw another guy riding his bike, and he sort of was the in-between reaction. He was like looking around, trying to figure out what to do. And I myself didn't know what to do, right? So Aliza's right. You know, the first instinct is you have no idea what's going on. And then it starts to sink in, but not really. And it wasn't until I would say a day later, and we had, you know, gone back and forth, heard sirens here in Yerushalayim, back and forth into the shelter, until you really start to understand what was going on. And I think, you know, because it was Yontif and people didn't exactly, you know, the news was sort of filtering. But then you start to see your neighbors, like their kids are packing up because they're heading out to go to they got called up and everything. Then it starts becoming much more real. And we actually stayed around afterwards for a little more than a week extra than we were supposed to stay for, because we weren't sure. We weren't sure, should we leave? Should we not leave? How can we be helpful? And as you remember, things were a little disorganized at the time, and so my sort of biggest memory from getting back to America was how detached really we were from here. You were, even though we weren't really living in it, because we didn't have children, you know, going to the army. We didn't have relatives or friends, you know, really too deeply involved. But certainly across the pond in New York, we really felt disconnected from it. And so that was one feeling that I had throughout the course of the year. And you try to stay connected in any, you know, in little ways. And the communities certainly in America have tried to do that, and certainly have done a lot, whether it's, you know, chesed, you know, organizations, or raising money, or sending supplies, or tefillah gatherings, Tehillim gatherings, and all that. But the day-to-day, you sort of, after a little bit of time, realize that you're falling back into a normal life that sort of doesn't acknowledge what's going on here. And that for me was a big thing. It was a challenge for me this year to try to have it sort of in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to feeling clueless, and I think that we in America, you can't presume to know what it's like for people living here day to day, and you have to, you know, try to remember that and be respectful of that. And but it also is that thing that, you know, underneath it all drives you to want to be here more.
Okay, I want to close off with one last question. You always come off to me as very, very calm. And you mentioned before, life is not always easy. There have been challenges with kids and schools and day-to-day busyness. And for me, I have a hard time staying calm when my 1-year-old takes his bowl of cornflakes and milks and decide that it's better on the floor. So I wonder if you give me any advice to keeping your calm, and to sort of, as you mentioned before, filtering the important from the unimportant and allowing that to help you retain an equilibrium.
Yeah, get 20 years older. No, really, like it's there are, and I see it today, and I think we're blessed with very, very lovely, thoughtful daughters-in-law who've joined our family, who are remarkably calm in the face of cornflakes on the floor type things. And I think that I was not that calm. So, you know, can't do it over. Wish I could, some of it, but age is a great calming influence, honestly, like perspective, and just try to remember in the moment that it's really just one little thing.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.